Good evening, my loves, my babies, and my gentle beans. How are you this fine evening? We have come to the end of this book, my darlings. We are on the final chapters of The Wonder Book for Children by Nathaniel Hawthorne. But there is a sequel. So we're not done with the flowery language. We will move on to the next book after we are done with this final story, The Chimera. We are at Bald Summit, where the older children have hiked up with Eustace Bright to the top of the hill, and that is where we will have our final story. Upward along the steep and wooded hillside went Eustace Bright and his companion. The trees were not yet in full leaf, but had bounded forth sufficiently to throw an airy shadow while the sunshine filled them with the green light. There were moss-grown rocks, half hidden among the old brown fallen leaves. There were rotten tree trunks lying at full length where they had long ago fallen. There were decayed boughs that had been shaken down by the wintry gales and were scattered everywhere about. But still, though these things looked so aged, the aspect of the wood was that of newest life, for whichever way you turned your eyes, something fresh and green was springing forth, so as to be ready for the summer. At last the young people reached the upper verge of the wood and found themselves almost at the summit of the hill. It was not a peak, nor a great round ball, but a pretty wide plain or tableland, with a house and a barn upon it at some distance. That house was the home of a solitary family, and oftentimes the clouds whence fell the rain and whence the snowstorm drifted down into the valley hung lower than its bleak and lonely dwelling place. On the highest point of the hill was a heap of stones, in the center of which was stuck a long pole with a little flag fluttering at the end of it. Eustace led the children thither and bade them to look around and see how large a tract of our beautiful world they could take in at a glance. And their eyes grew wider as they looked. Monument Mountain, so to the southward, was still in the center of the scene, but seemed to have sunk and subsided, so that it was now but an undistinguished member of a large family of hills. Beyond the Teutonic Range looked higher and bulkier than before. Our pretty lake was seen, with all its little bays and inlets, and not that alone, but 2 or 3 new lakes were opening to their blue eyes to the sun. Several white villages, each with its steeple, were scattered about in the distance. There were so many farmhouses, with the acres of woodland, pasture, mowing fields, and tillage, that the children could hardly make room in their minds to receive all of these different objects. There, too, was Tanglewood, which they had hitherto thought such an important apex of the world. Now it occupied so small a space that they gazed far beyond it on either side, and searched a good while with all their eyes before discovering whereabout it stood. White, fleecy clouds were hanging in the air, and threw the dark spots of their shadow here and there over the landscape. But by and by the sunshine was where the shadow had been, and the shadow was somewhere else. Far to the westward was a range of blue mountains, which Eustace told the children were the Catskills. Among those misty hills, he said, was a spot where the old Dutchmen were playing an everlasting game of ninepins, and where an idle fellow whose name was Rip Van Winkle had fallen asleep and slept 20 years at a stretch. The children eagerly besought Eustace to tell them all about this wonderful affair, But the student replied that the story had been told once already, and better than it ever could be told again, and that nobody would have a right to alter a word of it until it should have grown as old as the Gorgon's head, and the 3 golden apples, and the rest of those miraculous legends. "At least," said Periwinkle, "while we rest ourselves here and are looking about, as you can tell us another one of your stories." "Yes, Cousin Eustace," cried Primrose. "I advise you to tell us a story here. Take some lofty subject or other, and see if your imagination will not come up with it. Perhaps the mountain air may make you poetical for once. And no matter how strange and wonderful the story may be, now that we are up among the clouds, we can believe anything." "Can you believe," asked Cousin Eustace, "that there was once a winged horse?" "Yes," said saucy Primrose, "but I'm afraid you will never be able to catch him." "For that matter, Primrose," rejoined the student, "I might possibly catch a Pegasus, and get upon its back too, as well as a dozen other fellows that I know of. At any rate, here is a story about him, and of all the places in the world it ought certainly to be told is upon a mountain top." So sitting on the pile of stones, while the children clustered themselves at its base, Eustace fixed his eyes on the white cloud that was sailing by, and began as follows. The Chimera. Once, in the old times, for all the strange things which I tell you about happened long before anybody can remember, a fountain gushed out of a hillside in a marvelous land of Greece. And for aught I know, after so many thousands of years, it is still gushing out of that very same spot. At any rate, there was a pleasant fountain welling freshly forth and sparkling down the hillside in the golden sun, when a handsome young man named Bellerophon drew upon its margin. In his hand he held a bridle studded with brilliant gems and adorned with a golden bit. Seeing an old man and another of middle age, and a little boy near the fountain, and likewise a maiden who was dipping some water in a pitcher, he paused and begged that he might refresh himself with a draught. "This is very delicious water," he said to the maiden as he rinsed and filled her pitcher after drinking out of it. "Will you be kind enough to tell me whether the fountain has any name?" "Yes, it is called the Fountain of Priene," answered the maiden, and then she added, "My grandmother has told me that this clear fountain was once a beautiful woman, and when her son was killed by the arrows of the huntress Diana, she melted away into tears, and so the water which you find so cool and sweet is the sorrow of that poor mother's heart." "I should not have dreamed," observed the younger stranger, "that so clear a wellspring, with its gush and gurgle and its cheery dance out of the shade into the sunlight, and so much as one teardrop in its bosom. And this then is Priene? I thank you, maiden, for telling me its name. I have come from far away to find this very spot." A middle-aged country fellow, he had driven his cow to drink out of the spring, stared hard at young Bellerophon, and at the handsome bridle which he carried in his hand. "The watercourses must be getting low, friend, in your part of the world," remarked he, "if you come so far only to find the Fountain of Priene. But pray, have you lost a horse? I see you carry a bridle in your hand, and a very pretty one it is, with that double row of bright stones upon it. If the horse was as fine as the bridle, you are much pitied to be losing him." "I have no horse," said Bellerophon with a smile, "but I happen to be seeking a very famous one, which, as wise people have informed me, must be found hereabouts, if anywhere." Do you know whether the winged horse Pegasus still haunts the Fountain of Priene, as he used to do in our forefathers' days?" But then the country fellow laughed. "Some of you, my little friends, have probably heard that this Pegasus was a snow-white steed with beautiful silvery wings, who spent most of its time on the summit of Mount Helicon. He was as wild and as swift and as buoyant in his flight through the air as any eagle that ever soared into the clouds. There was nothing else like him in the world. He had no mate. He had never been backed or bridled by any master, and for many long years he led a solitary and happy life. Oh, how fine a thing it is to be a winged horse! Sleeping at night as he did on a lofty mountain top, and passing the greater part of the day in the air, Pegasus seemed hardly to be a creature of the earth. Whenever he was seen up very high above people's heads, with the sunshine on his silvery wings, you would have thought that he belonged to the sky, and that, skimming a little too low, he had gone astray among our mists and vapors, and was seeking his way back up again. It was very pretty to behold, to see him plunge in the fleecy blossom of a white, bright cloud, and be lost in it for a moment or two, and then break forth from the other side. Or in a sullen rainstorm, when there was a gray pavement of clouds over the whole sky, it would sometimes happen that the winged horse descended right through it, and the glad light of the upper region would gleam after him. In another instant, "Thank you, wise Alpha Wolf. It's lovely to see you." In another instant, it is true, both Pegasus and the pleasant light would be gone. "Hi, Vanna. Good to see you." But anyone that was fortunate enough to see this wondrous spectacle felt cheerful the whole day afterward, and as much longer as the storm lasted. "Buttered Pop-Tart, thank you. I appreciate you so much. Welcome in." In the summertime, and in the most beautiful of weather, Pegasus often alighted on the solid earth, and, closing his silvery wings, would gallop over hill and dale for pastime as fleetly as when he was in the wind. Oftener than in any other place, he had been seen near the Fountain of Priene, drinking the delicious water or rolling himself upon the soft grass of the margin. Sometimes, too, because Pegasus was very dainty in his food, he would crop a few clover blossoms that happened to be the sweetest. To the Fountain of Priene, therefore, people's great-grandfathers had been in the habit of going, as long as they were youthful and retained their faith in winged horses, in hopes of getting a glimpse at the beautiful Pegasus. But of late years he had been very seldom seen. Indeed, there were many of the country folks dwelling within half an hour's walk of the fountain who had never beheld Pegasus, and did not believe that there was any such creature in existence. The country fellow to whom Bellerophon was speaking chanced to be one of those incredulous persons, and that was the reason why he laughed. "Pegasus, indeed!" cried he, turning up his nose as high as such a flat nose could be turned up. "Pegasus, indeed! A winged horse, truly! Why, friend, are you in your senses? Of what use would wings be on a horse? Could he drag the plough so well, think you? To be sure, there might be a little saving in the expense of shoes. But then how would a man like to see his horse flying out of the stable window? Yes, or whisking him up above the clouds, when he only wanted to ride to the mill? No, no, I don't believe in Pegasus. There was never such a ridiculous kind of horse-fowl made." "I have some reason to think otherwise," said Bellerophon quietly. and then he turned to an old gray man who was leaning on a staff and listening very attentively with his head stretched forward and one hand at his ear, because for the last 20 years he had been getting rather deaf. "And what say you, venerable sir?" inquired he. "In your younger days, I should imagine you must frequently have seen the winged steed." "Ah, young stranger, my memory is very poor," said the aged man. "When I was a lad, if I remember rightly, I used to believe there was such a horse, and so did everyone else. But nowadays I hardly know what to think, and very seldom think about the winged horse at all. If I ever saw the creature, it was a long, long while ago, and to tell you the truth, I doubt whether I ever did see him. One day, to be sure, when I was quite a youth, I remember seeing some hoof tramps around the brink of the fountain. Pegasus might have made those hoof marks, and so might have any other horse." "And have you never seen him, my fair maiden?" Bellerophon said to the girl, who stood with the pitcher on her head while this talk went on. "You surely could see Pegasus if anybody can, for your eyes are very bright." "Once I thought I saw him," replied the maiden with a smile and a blush. "It was either Pegasus or a very large white bird, a very great way up in the air. And one other time, pardon me. Just a cough and a sip of tea. And one other time, as I was coming to the fountain with my pitcher, I heard a neigh. Oh, such a brisk and melodious neigh it was. My very heart leaped with delight at the sound, but it startled me nevertheless, so I ran home without filling my pitcher." "That was truly a pity," said Bellerophon. And he turned to the child, whom I mentioned in the beginning of the story, and who was gazing at him, as children are apt to gaze at strangers, with his rosy mouth wide open. "Well, my little fellow," cried Bellerophon, playfully pulling at one of his curls, "I suppose you have often seen the winged horse?" "That I have," answered the child very readily. "I saw him yesterday and many times before." "You are a fine little man," said Bellerophon, drawing the child closer to him. "Come, tell me all about it." "Why," replied the child, "I often come here to sail little boats in the fountain and to gather pretty pebbles out of its basin. And sometimes when I look down into the water, I see the image of the winged horse in the picture of the sky that is there. I wish he would come down and take me on his back and let me ride him up to the moon. But if I so much as stir to look at him, he flies far away, out of sight." And Bellerophon put his faith in the child who has seen the image of Pegasus in the water, and in the maiden who had heard him neigh so melodiously, rather than in the middle-aged clown who believed only in cart horses, or the old man who had forgotten the beautiful things of his youth. Therefore he haunted about the fountain of Preen for a great many days. He kept continually on the watch, looking upward at the sky, else down into the water, hoping forever he should see either the reflected image of the winged horse or the marvelous reality. He held the bridle with its bright gems and golden bit always ready in his hand. The rustic people who dwelt in the neighborhood and drove their cattle to the fountain to drink would often laugh at poor Bellerophon, and sometimes they take him pretty severely to task. They told him that an able-bodied young man like himself ought to have better business than to be wasting his time in such an idle pursuit. They offered to sell him a horse if he wanted one, and when Bellerophon declined the purchase, they tried to drive a bargain with him for his fine bridle. Even the country boys thought him so very foolish that they used to have a great deal of sport with him, and were rude enough not to care a fig, although Bellerophon saw and heard it. One little urchin, for example, would play Pegasus, and cut the oddest imaginable capers by way of flying, while one of his schoolfellows would scamper after him, holding forth a twist of bulrushes, which was intended to represent Bellerophon's ornamental bridle. But the gentle child who had seen the picture of Pegasus in the water comforted the young stranger more than all the naughty boys could torment him. The dear little fellow in his play hours often sat down beside him and, without speaking a word, would look down into the fountain and up towards the sky, with so innocent a faith that Bellerophon could not help but feel encouraged. "Absolutely," puttered Pop-Tort. "It was lovely to see you. Come back any time." Now you will perhaps wish to be told why it was that Bellerophon had undertaken to catch the winged horse, and we shall find no better opportunity to speak about this matter than while he is waiting for Pegasus to appear. If I were to relate the whole of Bellerophon's previous adventures, they might easily grow into a very long story. It will be quite enough to say that in a certain country of Asia, a terrible monster called a chimera had made its appearance and was doing more mischief than could be talked about between now and sunset. According to the best accounts which I have been able to obtain, this chimera was nearly, if not quite, the ugliest and most poisonous creature, and the strangest and unaccountablest, and hardest to fight with, and the most difficult to run away from that had ever come outside of the earth's inside. It had a tail like a boa constrictor. Its body was like I do not care what, and it had 3 separate heads, one of which was a lion's, the second a goat's, and the third an abominably great snake's. And a hot blast of fire came flaming out of each of its 3 mouths. Being an earthly monster, I doubt whether it had any wings, but wings or no, it ran like a goat and a lion, and wriggled along like a serpent, and thus contrived to make it about as much speed as all 3 together. Oh, the mischief and mischief and mischief that this naughty creature did! With its flaming breath, it could set a forest on fire or burn up a field of grain, or for that matter, a village with all of its fences and houses. It laid waste the whole country round about, and used to eat up people and animals alive, and cook them afterward in the burning oven of its stomach. Mercy on us, little children. I hope neither you nor I will ever happen to meet a chimera. While the hateful beast, if a beast we can anywise call it, was doing all these horrible things, it so chanced that Bellerophon came to that part of the world to visit the king. The king's name was Iobates, and Lyca was the country that he ruled over. Bellerophon was one of the bravest youths in the world, and desired nothing so much as to do some valiant and beneficent deed, such as would make all mankind admire and love him. In those days, the only way for a young man to distinguish himself was by fighting battles, either with the enemies of his country, or with wicked giants, or with troublesome dragons, or with wild beasts, when he could find nothing more dangerous to encounter. King Iobates perceived the courage of this youthful visitor, and proposed to him to go and fight the chimera, which everybody else was afraid of, and which, unless it should soon be killed, was likely to convert Lyca to a desert. Bellerophon hesitated not a moment, and assured the king that he would either slay this dreaded chimera, or perish in the attempt. But in the first place, as the monster was so prodigiously swift, he bethought himself that he should never win the victory by fighting on foot. The wisest thing he could do, therefore, was to get the very best and fleetest horse that could anywhere be found. And what other horse in all of the world was half so fleet as the marvelous horse Pegasus, who had wings as well as legs, and was even more active in the air than on the earth? To be sure, a great many people denied that there was any such horse with wings, and said that the stories about him were all poetry and nonsense. But wonderful as it appeared, Bellerophon believed that Pegasus was a real steed, and hoped that he himself might be fortunate enough to find him, and, once fairly mounted on his back, he would be able to fight Chimera at better advantage. And this was the purpose with which he had traveled from Lycia to Greece, and had brought the beautifully ornamented bridle in his hand. It was an enchanted bridle. If he could only succeed in putting the golden bit into the mouth of Pegasus, the winged horse would be submissive, and would own Bellerophon for his master, and fly whithersoever he would choose to turn the rein. But indeed it was a weary and anxious time while Bellerophon waited and waited for Pegasus, in hopes that he would come and drink at the fountain of Priene. He was afraid lest King Iobates should imagine that he had fled from the Chimera. It pained him too to think of how much mischief the monster was doing, while he himself, instead of fighting with it, was compelled to sit idly poring over the bright waters of Priene as they gushed out of the sparkling sand. And as Pegasus came thither so seldom in these latter years, and scarcely alighted there for more than once in a lifetime, Bellerophon feared that he might grow an old man, and have no strength left in his arms nor courage in his heart, before the winged horse would appear. Oh, how heavily passes the time while an adventurous youth is yearning to do his part in life, and to gather in the harvest of his renown. How hard a lesson it is to wait. Our life is brief, and how much of it is spent in teaching us only this. Well, it was for Bellerophon that the gentle child had grown so fond of him, and was never weary of keeping him company. Every morning the child gave him a new hope to put in his bosom instead of yesterday's withered one. "Dear Bellerophon," he would cry, looking up hopefully into his face, "I think we shall see Pegasus today." And at length, if it had not been for the little boy's unwavering faith, Bellerophon would have given up all hope, and would have gone back to Lycia, and have done the best to slay the Chimera without the help of the winged horse. And in that case, poor Bellerophon would at least have been terribly scorched by the creature's breath, and would most probably have been killed and devoured. Nobody should ever try to fight an earth-born chimera unless he can first get upon the back of an aerial steed. One morning, the child spoke to Bellerophon even more hopefully than usual. "Dear, dear Bellerophon," cried he, "I know not why it is, but I feel as if we should certainly see Pegasus today." And all that day he would not stir a step from Bellerophon's side. So they ate a crust of bread together and drank some water of the fountain. In the afternoon there they sat, and Bellerophon had thrown his arm around the child, so likewise to put one of his little hands into Bellerophon's. The latter was lost in his own thoughts, and fixing his eyes vacantly on the trunks of the trees that overshadowed the fountain, and on the grapevines that clambered up among their branches. But the gentle child was gazing down into the water. He was grieved for Bellerophon's sake, that the hope of another day should be deceived like so many before it. And 2 or 3 quiet teardrops fell from his eyes and mingled with what were said to be the many tears of Priene as she wept for her slain children. But when he least thought of it, Bellerophon felt the pressure of the little child's hand in his and heard a soft, almost breathless whisper. "There, dear Bellerophon, there is an image in the water." The young man looked down into the dimpling mirror of the fountain and saw what he took to be the reflection of a bird, which seemed to be flying at a great height in the air, with a gleam of sunshine on its snowy or silvery wings. "What a splendid bird it must be," said he, "and how very large it looks, though it must really be flying higher than the clouds." "Tremble," whispered the child. "I'm afraid to look up into the air. It is very beautiful, yet I dare only look at its image in the water. Dear Bellerophon, do you not see that it is no bird? It is the winged horse Pegasus." Bellerophon's heart began to throb. He gazed keenly upward, but could not see the winged creature, whether bird or horse, because just then it plunged into the fleecy depths of a summer cloud. It was but a moment, however, before the object reappeared, sinking lightly down out of the cloud, although still a vast distance from the earth. Bellerophon caught the child in his arms and shrank back with him, until they were both hidden among the thick shrubbery which grew all around the fountain. Not that he was afraid of any harm, but he dreaded lest if Pegasus caught a glimpse of them he would fly far away and alight some inaccessible mountain top. For it was really the winged horse. After they had expected him so long, he was coming to quench his thirst with the water of Preen. Nearer and nearer came the aerial wonder, flying in great circles, as you may have seen a dove when it is about to alight. Downward came Pegasus in those wide, sweeping circles, which grew narrower and narrower, still as he gradually approached the earth. The nigher the view of him, the more beautiful he was, and the more marvelous the sweep of his silvery wings. At last, with so light a pressure as hardly to bend the grass about the fountain or imprint a hoof tramp in the sand of its margin, he alighted, and stooping, his wild head began to drink. He drew in the water with long and pleasant sighs and tranquil pauses of enjoyment. And then another draught, and another, and another. For nowhere in the world or up among the clouds did Pegasus love any water as much as this of Preen. And when his thirst was slaked, he cropped a few honey blossoms of the clover, delicately tasting them, but not caring to make a hearty meal, because the herbage just beneath the clouds on the lofty sides of the mountain suited his palate better than the ordinary grass. After thus drinking to his heart's content, he in his dainty fashion condescended to take a little food. The winged horse began to caper to and fro and dance, as it were out of mere idle sport. There was never a more playful creature made than this very Pegasus. So there he frisked in a way that delights me to think about, fluttering his great wings as lightly as ever did a linnet, and running little races, half on earth and half in the air, which I know not whether to call a flight or a gallop. When a creature is perfectly able to fly, he sometimes chooses to run just for the pastime of the thing, and so did Pegasus, although it cost him some little trouble to keep his hooves so near the ground. Bellerophon, meanwhile, holding the child's hand, peeped forth from the shrubbery, and thought that never was any sight so beautiful as this, nor ever a horse's eyes so wild and spirited as those of Pegasus. It seemed a sin to think of bridling him and riding on his back. Once or twice Pegasus stopped and snuffled the air, pricking up his ears and tossing his head, turning it on all sides, as if he partly suspected some mischief or another. Seeing nothing, however, and hearing no sound, he soon began his antics again. At length, not that he was weary, but only idle and luxurious, Pegasus folded his wings and lay down on the soft green turf. But being too full of aerial life to remain quiet for too many moments together, he soon rolled over on his back, with his 4 slender legs in the air. It was beautiful to see him, this one solitary creature whose mate had never been created, but who needed no companion, and living a great many 100 years, was as happy as the centuries were long. The more he did such things as mortal horses are accustomed to do, the less earthly and more wonderful he seemed. Bellerophon and the child almost held their breath, partly from the delighted awe, but still more because they dreaded lest the slightest stir or murmur should send him up with the speed of an arrow flight without the furthest blue of the sky. Finally, when he had had enough of rolling over and over, Pegasus turned himself about and indolently, like any other horse, put out his 4 legs in order to rise from the ground. And Bellerophon, who had guessed that he would do so, darted suddenly from the thicket and leapt astride of his back. Yes, there he sat on the back of a winged horse. But what a bound did Pegasus make when for the first time he felt the weight of a mortal man upon his loins. A bound indeed! Before he had time to draw a breath, Bellerophon found himself 500 feet aloft. Hi, Cynthia. Lovely to see you. I will definitely take that hydrate. I cheated today. It's not tea, it's hot cocoa. But don't tell. You're the best. You're the best around. Thank you very much for the hydrate. While the winged horse snorted and trembled with terror and anger, upward he went, up, until he plunged into the cold, misty bosom of a cloud at which, only a little while before, Bellerophon had been gazing and fancying it a very pleasant spot. Then again, out of the heart of the cloud, Pegasus shot down like a thunderbolt, as if he had meant to dash both himself and his rider headlong against a rock. Then he went through 1,000 of the wildest caprioles that had ever been performed either by a bird or horse. I cannot tell you half that he did. He skimmed straight forward and sideways and backward. He reared himself erect, and his 4 legs on the wreath of a mist, and his hind legs on nothing at all. He flung out his heels behind him and put down his head between his legs, with his wings pointing right upward at about 2 miles high above the earth. He turned a somersault so that Bellerophon's heels were where his head should have been, and he seemed to look down into the sky instead of up. He twisted his head about and, looking Bellerophon in the face with a fire flashing from his eyes, made a terrible attempt to bite him. He fluttered his pinions so wildly that one of the silver feathers, shaken out and floating earthward, was picked up by the child, who kept it as long as he lived, in memory of Pegasus and Bellerophon. But the latter, who, as you may judge, as good a horseman as ever galloped, had been watching his opportunity, and at very last clapped the golden bit of the enchanted bridle between the winged steed's jaws. No sooner was this done than Pegasus became as manageable as if he had taken food all of his life out of Bellerophon's hand. To speak what I really feel, it is almost sadness to see a wild creature grow suddenly so tame. And Pegasus seemed to feel it so likewise. He looked around to Bellerophon with tears in his beautiful eyes, instead of the fires that so recently flashed from them. But when Bellerophon patted his head and spoke a few authoritative, yet kind and soothing words, another look came into the eyes of Pegasus, for he was glad at heart after so many lonely centuries to have found a companion and a master. Thus it always is with winged horses and with all such wild solitary creatures. If you can catch and overcome them, it is the surest way to win their love. While Pegasus had been doing his utmost to shake Bellerophon off of his back, he had flown a very long distance, and they had come within sight of a lofty mountain by the time the bit was in his mouth. Bellerophon had seen this mountain before and knew it to be Helicon, on the summit of which was the winged horse's abode. Thither, after looking gently into his rider's face as if to ask to leave. "Hi, John. Welcome in. It's lovely to see you." Pegasus now flew and, alighting, waited patiently until Bellerophon should please to dismount. The young man accordingly leapt from his steed's back, but still held him fast by the bridle. Meeting his eyes, however, he was so affected by the gentleness of his aspect, and by his beauty, and by the thought of the free life which Pegasus had heretofore lived, that he could not bear to keep him prisoner if he really desired his liberty. Obeying this generous impulse, he slipped the enchanted bridle off of Pegasus and took the bit from his mouth. "Leave me, Pegasus," said he. "Either leave me or love me." In an instant, the winged horse shot almost out of sight, soaring straight upward from the summit of Mount Helicon. Being long after sunset, it was now twilight on the mountain top, and the dusky evening over all the country round about. But Pegasus flew so high that he overtook the departed day, and was bathed in the upper radiance of the sun. Ascending higher and higher, he looked like a bright speck, and at last could no longer be seen in the hollow waste of the sky. And Bellerophon was afraid that he should never behold him any more. But while he was lamenting his own folly, the bright speck reappeared, and drew nearer and nearer until it descended lower than the sunshine, and behold, Pegasus had come back. After this trial, there was no more fear of the winged horse making his escape. He and Bellerophon were friends, and put loving faith in one another. That night they lay down and slept together, with Bellerophon's arm around the neck of Pegasus, not as a caution, but for kindness. And they awoke at peep of day and bade one another good morning, each in his own language. In this manner Bellerophon had the wondrous steed spent several days, and grew better acquainted and fonder of each other all of the time. They went on long aerial journeys, and sometimes ascended so high that the earth looked hardly bigger than the moon. They visited different countries, and amazed in the inhabitants, who thought that the beautiful young man on the back of a winged horse must have come down out of the sky. 1,000 miles a day was no more an easy space for the fleet Pegasus to pass over. Bellerophon was delighted with this kind of life, and would have liked nothing better than to live always in the same way, aloft in the clear atmosphere, for it was always sunny weather up there, however cheerless and rainy it might be in the lower region. But he could not forget the horrible chimera, which he had promised King Iobates to slay. So at last, when he had become well accustomed to feats of horsemanship in the air, he could manage Pegasus with the least motion of his hand, and had taught him to obey his voice, he determined to attempt the performance of this perilous adventure. At daybreak, therefore, as soon as he unclosed his eyes, he gently pinched the winged horse's ear in order to arouse him. Pegasus immediately started from the ground and pranced about 1/4 of a mile aloft, and made a grand sweep around the mountain top by way of showing that he was wide awake and ready for any kind of an excursion. During the whole of this little flight, he uttered a loud, brisk, and melodious neigh, and finally came down at Bellerfon's side, as lightly as ever you saw a sparrow hop on a twig. "Well done, dear Pegasus, well done, my sky skimmer," cried Bellerophon, fondly stroking the horse's neck. "And now, my fleet and beautiful friend, we must break our fast. Today we are to fight the terrible Chimera." As soon as they had eaten their morning meal and drank some sparkling water. "Hi, Charlie." From a spring called Hippocrene, Pegasus held out his head of his own accord so that the master might put on the bridle. Then, with a great many playful leaps and airy caperings, he showed his impatience to be gone while Bellerophon was grinding his sword and hanging his shield about his neck, preparing himself for battle. When everything was ready, the rider mounted and, as was his custom when going a long distance, ascended 5 miles perpendicularly, so as to better see whither he was directing his course. He then turned the head of Pegasus towards the east and set out for Lyca. In their flight they overtook an eagle and came so nigh him before he could get out of their way that Bellerophon might easily have caught him by the leg. Hastening onward at this rate, it was still nearly in the forenoon when they beheld the lofty mountains of Lyca and their deep and shaggy valleys. If Bellerophon had been told truly, it was in one of those dismal valleys that the hideous Chimera had taken up its abode. Being now so near their journey's end, the wicked horse gradually descended with his rider, and they took advantage of some clouds that were floating over the mountain tops in order to conceal themselves. Hovering on the upper surface of a cloud and peeping over its edge, Bellerophon had a pretty distinct view of the mountainous part of Lyca, and could look into all of its shadowy vales at once. At first there appeared to be nothing remarkable. It was a wild, savage, and rocky tract of high and precipitous hills. In the more level part of the country there were ruins of houses that had been burned, and there were carcasses of dead cattle strewn about in pastures where they had been feeding. "The Chimera must have done this mischief," said Bellerophon, "but where can the monster be?" As I have already said, there was nothing remarkable to detect at first sight in any of the valleys and dells that lay among the precipitous heights of the mountains. Nothing at all, unless indeed it were the 3 spires of black smoke which issued from what seemed to be the mouth of a cavern and clambered sullenly into the atmosphere. Before reaching the mountain top, these 3 black smoke wreaths mingled themselves into one. The cavern was almost directly beneath the winged horse and his rider, at the distance of about 1,000 feet. The smoke, as it crept heavily upward, had an ugly, sulphurous, stifling scent which caused Pegasus to snort and Bellerophon to sneeze. So disagreeable was it to the marvelous steed, who was accustomed to breathing only the purest air, that he waved his wings and shot 1/2 mile out of range of this offensive vapor. Hydrate, everybody, hydrate. But on looking behind him, Bellerophon saw something that induced him first to draw in the bridle and then to turn Pegasus about. He made a sign which the horse understood, and sunk slowly through the air until his hooves, scarcely more than a man's height above the rocky bottom of the valley. In front, as far off as you could throw a stone, was the cavern's mouth, with the 3 smoke wreaths oozing out of it. And what else did Bellerophon behold there? There seemed to be a heap of strange and terrible creatures, curled up within a cavern. Their bodies lay so close together that Bellerophon could not distinguish them apart, but judging by their heads, one of the creatures was a huge snake, the second a fierce lion, and the third an ugly goat. The lion and the goat were asleep. The snake was broad awake and kept staring around him with a great pair of fiery eyes. But, and this was the most wonderful part of the matter, the 3 spires of smoke evidently issued from the nostrils of these heads. So strange was the spectacle that Bellerophon had been all along expecting it. The truth did not immediately occur to him that here was the terrible 3-headed chimera. He had found out the chimera's cavern. The snake, the lion, and the goat, as he supposed them to be, were no longer 3 separate creatures, but one monster. The wicked, hateful thing, slumbering as 2/3 of it were, it still held its abominable claws, the remnant of an unfortunate lamb. Or possibly, but I hate to think so, it was a dear little boy, which its 3 mouths had been gnawing before 2 of them fell asleep. All at once Bellerophon started from the dream, and knew that it had to be the chimera. Pegasus seemed to know it at the same instant and sent forth a neigh that sounded like the call of a trumpet battle. At the sound, the 3 heads reared themselves erect and belched out great flashes of flame. Before Bellerophon had time to consider what to do next, the monster flung itself out of the cavern and sprung straight toward him with its immense claws extended and its shaky tail twisting itself venomously behind. If Pegasus had not been as nimble as a bird, both he and his rider would have been overthrown by Chimera's headlong rush, and thus the battle have been ended before it as well began. But the winged horse was not to be caught so. In the twinkling of an eye, he was up aloft, halfway into the clouds, snorting with anger. He shuddered, too, not with affright, but with utter disgust at the loathsomeness of this poisonous thing with its 3 heads. The chimera, on the other hand, raised itself up as to stand absolutely on the tip end of its tail, with its talons pawing fiercely in the air and its 3 heads sputtering fire at Pegasus and his rider. My stars, how it roared and hissed and bellowed! Bellerophon, meanwhile, fitting his shield to his arm and drawing his sword. "Now, my beloved Pegasus," he whispered into the horse's ear, "thou must help me slay this insufferable monster, or else thou shalt fly back to thy solitary mountain peak without thy friend Bellerophon. For either the chimera dies, or its 3 mouths shall gnaw at this head of mine, which has slumbered upon thy neck." Pegasus whinnied and turned back his head, rubbed his nose tenderly against his rider's cheek. It was his way of telling him that though he had wings and was an immortal horse, yet he would perish if it were possible for immortality to perish, rather than leave Bellerophon behind. "I thank you, Pegasus," answered Bellerophon. "Now then, let us make a dash at this monster." Uttering these words, he shook the bridle, and Pegasus darted down aslant, as swift as the flight of an arrow, toward the chimera's 3-fold head, which all at the same time was poking itself as high as it could into the air. As he came within arm's length, Bellerophon made a cut at the monster, but was carried onward by his steed before he could see whether the blow had been successful. Pegasus continued his course, but soon wheeled around at about the same distance from Chimera as before. Bellerophon then perceived that he had cut the goat's head of the monster almost off, so that it dangled downward by the skin, and seemed quite dead. But to make amends, the snake's head and the lion's head had taken all the fierceness of the dead one into itself, and spit flame and hissed and roared with the vast deal more fury than before. "Never mind, my brave Pegasus," cried Bellerophon. "With another stroke like that we will surely stop either its hissing or its roaring." And again he shook the bridle, dashing aslantwise as before. The winged horse made another arrow flight towards the Chimera, and Bellerophon aimed another downright stroke at one of the two remaining heads as he shot by. But this time neither he nor Pegasus escaped so well as the first. With the claws of the Chimera had given the young man a deep scratch on his shoulder, and had slightly damaged the left wing of the flying steed with the other. On his part, Bellerophon had mortally wounded the lion's head of the monster. Ooh, hang on, start the music. There we are. Insomuch that it now hung downward, with its fire almost extinguished, sending out gasps of thick black smoke. The snake's head, however, which was the only one now left, was twice as fierce and venomous as before. It belched forth shots of fire 500 yards long, and emitted hisses so loud, so harsh, and so ear-piercing that King Iobates heard them 50 miles off and trembled till the throne shook under him. "Well a day," thought the poor king, "the Chimera is certainly coming to devour me." Meanwhile Pegasus had again paused in the air and neighed angrily, while sparks of pure crystal flame darted out of its eyes. Now, how unlike the lurid fire of the Chimera. The aerial steed's spirit was all aroused, and so was that of Bellerophon. "Dost thou bleed, my immortal horse?" cried the young man, caring less for his own hurt than for the anguish of this glorious creature that ought never to have tasted pain. "The exorable Chimera shall pay for this mischief with his last head." Then he shook the bridle and shouted loudly, guided Pegasus, not aslantwise as before, but straight at the monster's hideous front. So rapid was the onset that it seemed but a dazzle and a flash before Bellerophon was as close as grapes to his enemy. The Chimera, by this time, after losing its second head, had gotten into a red-hot passion of pain and rampant rage. It so flounced about, half on the earth and partly in the air, that it was impossible to say which element it rested upon. It opened its snake-like jaws, such an abominable width that Pegasus might almost, I was going to say, have flown right down its throat, wings outspread, rider and all. At their approach, it shot out a tremendous blast of its fiery breath and enveloped Bellerophon and his steed in the perfect atmosphere of flame, singeing the wings of Pegasus, scorching off one whole side of the young man's golden ringlets, and making them both far hotter than was comfortable from head to foot. But this was nothing to what followed. When the airy rush of the winged horse had brought him within distance of 100 yards, the Chimera gave a spring and flung its huge, awkward, venomous, and utterly detestable carcass right upon poor Pegasus, clung round him with might and main, and tied up its snaky tail into a knot. Up flew the aerial steed, higher, higher, above the mountain peaks, above the clouds, and almost out of sight of solid earth. But still the earth-born monster kept its hold, and was borne upward along with the creature of light and air. Bellerophon, meanwhile, turning about, saw himself face to face with the ugly grimness of the Chimera's visage, and could only avoid being scorched to death or bitten right in twain by holding up his shield. Over the upper edge of the shield he looked sternly into the savage eyes of the monster, but the Chimera was so mad and wild with pain that it did not guard itself so well as it might else have been the case. Perhaps, after all, the best way to fight a Chimera is by getting as close to it as you can. In its efforts to stick its horrible iron claws into its enemy, the creature left its own breast quite exposed, and perceiving this, Bellerophon thrust his sword up to the hilt into its cruel heart. Immediately the snaky tail untied its knot. The monster let go its hold of Pegasus and fell from the vast height downward, while the fire within its bosom, instead of being put out, burned fiercer than ever, and quickly began to consume the dead carcass. Thus it fell out of the sky all aflame, and it being nightfall before it reached the earth, was mistaken for a shooting star or a comet. But at early sunrise some cottagers were going about their day's labor and saw to their astonishment that several acres of ground were strewn with black ashes. In the middle of a field there was a heap of whitened bones, and a great deal higher than a haystack. Nothing else was ever seen of the dreadful chimera. And when Bellerophon had won the victory, he bent forward and kissed Pegasus, while the tears stood in his eyes. "Back now, my beloved steed, back to the fountain of Preen." Pegasus skimmed through the air quicker than he ever did before, and reached the fountain in a very short time. And there he found the old man leaning on his staff, and the country fellow watering his cow, and the pretty maiden filling the pitcher. "I remember now," quoth the old man. "I saw this winged horse once before, when I was quite a lad, but it was 10 times handsomer in those days." "I own a cart horse worth 3 of him," said the country fellow. "If this pony were mine, the first thing I'd do would be to clip its wings." But the poor maiden said nothing, for she had always the luck to be afraid at the wrong time, so she ran away and let her pitcher tumble down and broke it. "Where is the gentle child," asked Bellerophon, "who used to keep me company and never lost his faith, and never was weary of gazing into the fountain?" "Here I am, dear Bellerophon," said the child softly. For the little boy had spent day after day on the margin of the Preen, waiting for his friend to come back. But when he perceived Bellerophon descending through the clouds, mounted on the winged horse, he had shrunk back into the shrubbery. He was a delicate and tender child, and dreaded lest the old man and the country fellow should see his tears gushing from his eyes. "Thou hast won the victory," he said joyfully, running to the knee of Bellerophon, who still sat on the back of Pegasus. I knew thou wouldst. Sorry, that one's hard. "Yes, dear child," replied Bellerophon, alighting from the winged horse. "But if thy faith had not helped me, I should never have waited for Pegasus, and never have gone up above the clouds, and never have conquered the terrible chimera. Thou, my beloved little friend, hast done it all, and now let us give Pegasus his liberty." So he slipped off the enchanted bridle from the head of the marvelous steed. "Be free forevermore, my Pegasus," cried he, and with a shade of sadness in his tone. "Be as free as thou art fleet." But Pegasus rested his head on Bellerophon's shoulders, and would not be persuaded to take flight. "Well then," said Bellerophon, caressing the airy horse, "thou shalt be with me as long as thou wilt, and we'll go together forthwith and tell King Iobates that the chimera is destroyed." Then Bellerophon embraced the gentle child and promised to come back to him again, and departed. But in after years that child took higher flights upon the aerial steed than ever did Bellerophon, and achieved more honorable deeds than his friend's victory over the chimera. For gentle and tender as he was, he grew to be a mighty poet. After the story. Eustace Bright told the legend of Bellerophon with as much fervor and animation as if he had really been taking a gallop on the winged horse. At the conclusion, he was gratified to discern by the glowing countenances of his auditors how greatly they had been interested. All their eyes were dancing in their heads, except those of Primrose, In her eyes there were positively tears, for she was conscious of something in the legends which the rest of the children were not yet old enough to feel. Child story as it was, the student had contrived to breathe through it the ardor, the generous hope, and the imaginative enterprise of youth. "I forgive you now, Primrose," he said, "for all your ridicule of myself and my stories. One tear pays for a great deal of laughter." "Well, Mr. Bright," answered Primrose, wiping her eyes and giving him another of her mischievous smiles, "it certainly does elevate your ideas to get your head above the clouds. I advise you never tell another story unless it be, as at present, from the top of a mountain." "Or from the back of a Pegasus," replied Eustace, laughing. "Don't you think that I succeeded pretty well in catching that wonderful pony?" "It was so like you in your madcap pranks," cried Primrose, clapping her hands. "I think I see you now on his back, 2 miles high, with your head downward. It is well that you have not really an opportunity of trying your horsemanship on any wilder a steed than our sober Davy or Old Hundred." "For my part, I wish I had Pegasus here at this moment," said the student. "I would mount him forthwith, and gallop about the country within circumference of a few miles, making literary calls on my brother authors. Dr. Dewey would be within my reach at the foot of the Teutonic. In Stockbridge yonder is Mr. James, conspicuous to all the world on his mountain pile of history and romance. Longfellow, I believe, is not yet at the Oxbow, else the winged horse would neigh at the sight of him. But here in Lennox I should find our most truthful novelist, who has made the scenery and life of Berkshire all her own. On the hither side of Pittsfield sits Herman Melville, shaping out the gigantic conception of his white whale, while the gigantic shape of Greylock looms upon him from his study window. Another bound of my flying steed would bring me to the door of Holmes, who I mentioned last because Pegasus would certainly unseat me the next minute to claim the poet as his rider." "Have we not an author for our next neighbor?" asked Primrose. "That silent man who lives in the old red house near Tanglewood Avenue, and whom we sometimes meet with 2 children at his side, in the woods or at the lake? I think I have heard of his having written a poem, or a romance, or an arithmetic, or school history, or some other kind of book." "Hush, Primrose, hush!" exclaimed Eustace in a thrilling whisper, putting his finger to his lip. "Not a word about that man, even on a hilltop. If our babble was to reach his ears and happen not to please him, he has but to fling a queer or 2 of paper into the stove, and you, Primrose, and I, and Periwinkle, Sweet Fern, Squash Blossom, Blue Eye, Huckleberry, Clover, Cowslip, Plantain, Milkweed, Dandelion, and Buttercup, and yes, wise Mr. Pringle, with his unfavorable circumstances on my legends, and poor Miss Pringle too, would all turn up into smoke and go whisking up the funnel. Our neighbor in the red house is a harmless sort of person enough, for aught I know as concerns the rest of the world, but something whispers to me that he has terrible power over ourselves, extending to nothing short of annihilation." "And would Tanglewood turn into smoke as well as we?" asked Periwinkle, quite appalled at the threatened destruction. "And then what would become of Ben and Bruin?" "Tanglewood would remain," replied the student, "looking just as it does now, but occupied by an entirely different family, and Ben and Bruin would still be alive, and would make themselves very comfortable with the bones from the dinner table without ever thinking of the good times that they and we had together." "What nonsense you are talking!" exclaimed Primrose. With idle chat of this kind, the party had already begun to descend the hill, and were now within the shadow of the woods. Primrose gathered some mountain laurel, the leaf of which, though through last year's growth, was still as verdant and elastic as if the frost and thaw had not alternately tried to force upon its texture. Of these twigs of laurel she twined a wreath, and took off the student's cap in order to place it on his brow. "Nobody else is likely to crown you for your stories," observed saucy Primrose. "So take this from me." "Do not be too sure," answered Eustace, looking really like a youthful poet, with the laurel among his glossy curls, "that I shall not win other wreaths by these wonderful and admirable stories. I mean to spend all my leisure during the rest of my vacation and throughout the summer term at college in writing them out for the press. Mr. J.T. Fields, with whom I became acquainted when he was in Berkshire last summer, and who is a poet as well as a publisher, will see their uncommon merit at a glance. He will get them illustrated, I hope, by Billings, and will bring them before the world under the very best auspices. In about 5 months from this moment I make no doubt of being reckoned among the lights of the age." "Poor boy," said Primrose half aside. "What a disappointment awaits him." Descending a little lower, Bruin began to bark, and was answered by the graver bow-wow of the respectable Ben. As they soon saw, the good old dog keeping a watchful eye over Dandelion, Sweet Fern, Cowslip, and Squash Blossom. These little people, quite recovered from their fatigue, had set about gathering checkerberries, and now came clambering to meet their playfellows. Thus reunited, the whole party went back down through Luther Butler's orchard, and made the best of their way home to Tanglewood. The end. And that is the end of A Wonder Book for Children by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Thank you for hanging out with me and listening to my story. And we will be back soon with the sequel. And we'll see what Tanglewood has in store for us. Have a lovely evening, babies and gentle beans. Good night.